Welcome back to episode 38 of the Anthrozoology podcast, where we pick up our conversation with Alisa Rubenstein in part two of our discussion on fattening and companion animals. So I just wanted to clarify for the reader. So what you're saying is, in your research, that there's this idea that fat human bodies are unhealthy. And you're saying the idea of that is now being translated to companion animals, specifically dogs and cats, that any companion animal, dog, cat, that is deemed overweight, which hasn't got a robust measuring system, is also means that cats and dogs are unhealthy if they are overweight by whatever standards. So that's what your research is coming up and saying. Just wanted to clarify that's
So I think, what the kind of thesis of my research is that because we're kind of learning all these things in humans and unpacking this kind of what's seeming a more and more erroneous narrative, I think we should be applying all of that to animals and saying, we're not sure if fat is unhealthy in humans. Humans are animals, right? So it's probably going to apply in our companion animals. We're not sure if humans are actually getting fatter, which, if being fat is unhealthy, that doesn't really matter. But, we've spun this web, so now we have to unspin it.
So you're also saying in your research that if a human that has a companion animal that is, using the term with scare quotes, obese, that is being blamed on the human caregiver by the veterinary profession. Is that what your research is saying?
Yes. So it's not, I'm kind of taking that out of another study that I would love to talk about because I think it's really interesting. It's interesting and it's troubling. But there's one study that I found when I was doing this research that found exactly that. It's a preliminary study. It was conducted by Rebecca Pearl, who's at the University of Penn. I think she's in the medical school. It came out in 2020, so kind of a couple years before I started looking into this. And so they found a lot of these same trends, like you said, this kind of like blaming the individual for their bodies in veterinary clinicians that we've been finding in human doctors. So what they did was they showed vet students and vets different combinations of caregivers and dogs. So you had thin caregiver, thin dog, fat caregiver, fat dog, fat caregiver, thin dog, and then what's the last one? The thin caregiver, fat dog. And when the two body types matched up, the participants would report that they felt that the caregiver was more responsible for the body type of the animal. So they would blame fat caregivers for their fat animals, and they would praise thin caregivers for their thin animals. And so that's kind of the same thing that we're seeing in people where like fat bodies are blameworthy, they're making these bad decisions and they're fat because they, don't have self-restraint. And the same thing is being applied to caregivers where it's like they're overindulgent, they're lazy, they're not taking good care of their animals. And so I think the exact words were, so participants expressed blame, frustration, disgust towards fat dogs. They also felt that fat caregivers were unlikely to comply with weight loss instructions for their animals. And that's not based on any kind of research. I really think that it's coming from these same biases that human doctors hold. And I think perhaps like just the wildest, most egregious thing that I found, and it was the similar kind of thread of self-reported data that people just say to researchers and not even realize that that's really not a good way of treating your patients, is that 10% of the participants, and I'm not sure if this, I would imagine that this was only the vets, not the vet students, but 10% of the participants reported that they have recommended that their human clients who are bringing in animals, the human clients seek weight loss advice from their physician. And I was like, so 10% admitted that they do this. There's probably a percentage that maybe does this and knows that it's a little bit out of pocket and they're not admitting that they're doing it. There's also probably a percentage of folks who aren't doing this overtly, but are, expressing this covert bias and how they're treating their patients. But can you imagine going to a vet clinic with your animal and your vet commenting on your body? Like, I would never come back. I would never go back. Like, and people love their pets. They want the best for their pets. But if that happened to me, I would never go back. And so the idea that we're not seeing worse treatment of companion animals in vet clinics, that we're not seeing like worse treatment and that maybe worse health outcomes aren't related to that. And we don't have any hard data to say that, but I find it, very compelling that that's probably what's happening.
So basically, you believe, and I can see absolutely why, that social bias and corporate interests, coming back to your comment about Ozempic, is actually influencing the medical field, not only in human health, but in animal health. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, if you know why this, I mean, I think we've all got ideas, but maybe you can speak about it from your research, why there's this push, not only the social bias, but also the corporate interests, and maybe you can pick up again on Ozempic and the other, like sale of pet foods, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with the history of like how we got here, but there's certainly this idea, and this kind of goes back to the anthrozoology of it all. These minoritized bodies, fat bodies being animalized, where we're devaluing animals when we compare fat bodies we describe them as like animalistic, they don't have any self-restraint, they eat too much, they don't exercise, they're lazy, all of these misconceptions about people. We compare them to animals, and I think that's why we devalue both. And I think there's also, kind of answering your question, also going back to the moral panic and I think also, Michelle, what you were saying about, what are we taking people's attention off of? But when you see this kind of like drummed up moral panic about fat folks, it'll be like, oh, they need, because people are getting fatter, we need more jet fuel to fly people. We need more energy to fly people, basically like rising healthcare costs. And so you're blaming it on this already very vulnerable population that just in day to day, we're saying like, hey, your body's wrong. And we're kind of putting that individual blame on people when it's really a systemic issue. And I think that's what we're trying to take people's attention off of, where rising healthcare costs aren't the fault of individual people. I mean, in the US, we have really terrible healthcare that we could just provide for people. And so I think that using fat folks as a scapegoat as well for the systemic issues, and then also trying to sell us, the pharmaceuticals, the diets, the weight loss food, I think that's what's kind of perpetuating the issue and why it's been really difficult to unpack.
I wanted to ask, which is probably a little bit outside your research, but you probably thought about it. How do the societal perceptions of obesity in food animals compare to those of companion animals and humans? I haven't researched this, but I'm assuming a thin livestock animal is not commodifiable as a larger, let's say whether that's muscle mass or adipose tissue or whatever, as a larger livestock animal. So have you seen any differences or similarities in livestock animal bodies? And have you touched on at all about the commodification and eating of livestock animal bodies, which then relate to both human obesity, in scare quotes, and companion animal obesity? Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really great question. Most of my research, I think because I was kind of trying to stick to like what's going on in the exam room, I didn't really think outside of companion animals. So not really related to this research, but my undergrad was at an agriculture school. So I think I can speak a little bit to your question. And you're definitely right that what we expect of commodified food animal bodies is very different than what we expect out of our companion animals. And if we're thinking about like meat animals, my understanding is a lot of the time they're going to be bred to have more muscle than fat. And so and that's very problematic for these animals. I mean, if you look at like chickens, I think they don't live very long lives. Like they just have so much muscle, their bodies aren't really meant to support that. And if they live past a certain point, a lot of times like their hearts give out, which is very, very sad. But we're not really thinking as much about fat in those cases because we don't eat fat, we eat muscle. With like dairy cows, they're constantly in this cycle of being pregnant, giving, lactating, being pregnant. That's physiologically really taxing. So if I were to guess, I would say that those animals are probably, we're seeing them being more underweight than anything else. So I definitely think there are some major differences between our livestock and our companion animals. And this is something I don't know a ton about, but I've seen a couple articles that tie our obese companion animals to obese children. I think that maybe that's a more direct parallel because we're blaming the parents or the caregivers in the case of the the entity or person that they're responsible for being overweight.
So I really like the concept of health at every size, because like you say, it focuses away from, it focuses on the individual, right? Nutrition, exercise is good for everybody. So yeah, I'm going to share just a little bit of anecdotal evidence because I think that sort of speaks to what you're saying, and maybe you can provide some insight into more research or interest in this area. But my previous two cats who are no longer with us, one was always on the higher end. The vet always said she was overweight. The other one was at the lower end. So I had the skinny cat and the fat cat. And I actually have one of the vet records when we were traveling. They had to do a health check, and it says overweight but otherwise healthy. And as they got older animals tend to get more ailments. I mean, they didn't really have any health issues till they were over 10. But I take the skinny cat and they'd sort of investigate and try and find out what was wrong with her, sort of if she had little ailments in her scabby skin. I take Yoda, the cat that they always said was slightly overweight, and it was sort of a dismissal thing, like, oh, she just needs to lose some weight. And she got older, she got a bit of arthritis, sciatica, and it was just dismissive, like, lose weight. And eventually they gave her some pain meds to sort of help her, and actually getting her moving really did help her. So that was the thing, that the pain meds allowed her to move more, which in turn made her healthy. But I think that's kind of like what you're saying a lot. It happens with humans, and perhaps it's happening with the vets now, because that's what I experienced with Yoda. It was just sort of an easy way for the vet to answer the problem, like, oh, she just needs to lose some weight, like, pay your bill and go home. Whereas the skinny cat, it was like they would actually investigate similar ailments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can absolutely see, like, if they say, hey, lose weight, and they don't give her pain meds, the cat's uncomfortable. It doesn't matter that she's, we've deemed her overweight, that cat's still going to be uncomfortable. So I think it's really great that they gave her pain meds. And if she started moving more and she lost some weight, I think it's that focus on weight that's problematic, right? It's not like, hey, maybe we should get your cat moving a little bit more. That'll really help with her joint pain. Maybe the weight is like related to a little bit of joint pain, but if we get her moving more, that'll help kind of twofold. It's that, like, focus on the weight. And I've seen also, I've heard of anecdotes from folks I know who were saying, I went to the vet with a dog that gained a lot of weight really rapidly, and I was worried about it. And they said, hey, lose weight. The dog had a thyroid issue that the vets didn't look into. And so, a rapid or weight gain or loss is indicative of typically of a health problem. But if you just say, hey, this dog's fat, it's the fat that's the issue, you're not going to get down to what's actually going on. It's probably not the fat itself that's the issue.
So what do you think are the implications for veterinary medicine and for patient care, because of this mirroring of the biases present in human healthcare? And following on from that, what areas of research do you think could be prioritised to better understand the intersection of fatness, health outcomes and societal biases? And sorry, just to add an extra one to that, and if it's too many, we can come back, is this a global issue, or is it something that you just looked at in America or the Western world? That'd be interesting to know more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with the last one first, because I did mostly look at the United States. That's where I'm based, kind of what I'm more familiar with. And it was so much to unpack that I was like, if I start going cross-cultural with this, like I'm just never going to write a paper that I can submit. It's going to be, you know, thesis level long. So everything I'm talking about is, as far as I know, United States based, maybe closer to like Western, but I don't know enough to say that it's global. And would you mind just repeating the first question again?
Yeah, so what do you think are the implications in patient healthcare in veterinary medicine for these kind of biases, whether they be implicit or explicit in people's beliefs, and
Yeah,
therefore prescription of foods, of medicine, etc.
I think what it kind of goes back to is like just this idea of like radicalizing One Health, because we're starting to make progress on the human side. We're not taking that and applying it to the animal side. So I think taking, for example, health at every size, no one in vet med is talking about that, as far as I know, but human doctors are starting to talk a lot more about it. So taking like those principles and applying them to the veterinary exam room. I think also expanding on Pearl's research is going to be the next step to figuring out what's really going on, because we know in humans that doctors spend less time with fat clients, they order fewer preventative tests, etc. We know that fat folks put off healthcare because they're worried about what's going to happen when they step into an exam room. And I think that when you look at the vet clinic, there's also, you know, there's obviously the power dynamic in a human clinic where typically the doctor holds more power. The doctor is the practitioner practicing on the patient. That power dynamic is going to be different depending on, you know, the identity of the patient and the doctor, et cetera. But when you're in a vet clinic, there's like this third interface that I also think is really interesting of the animal. So it's like you have the doctor client dynamic, you have the, possibly in the case of a fat individual bringing an animal in, like possibly a skinny fat dynamic. And you also have the human animal interface where now we have, you know, this doctor who has power over this animal and the caregiver who has power over this animal. And like, are those interests this, I mean, I think the interests are the same, right? The end goal is to have a healthier animal, but it just makes it so much muddier. So I think we need more research specifically in the vet clinic, because again, everything I'm saying is speculative. It's just based on what's going on in people. But are people avoiding healthcare, going to the vet? There's already so much mistrust in the healthcare system. I would guess that there's a lot of mistrust in the veterinary system as well. And so I think understanding, like, are people avoiding healthcare? Are people maybe, yeah, I think that's like the biggest thing is, are folks avoiding or putting off bringing an animal that they really care about to the vet because they're worried about how they're going to be treated by the vet and how their animal is going to be talked about by the vet. And we don't know if that's happening or not yet, but I think that's the next step.
So is that something you're going to do? Is that some research you're going to look into?
Oh, that's a great question. Maybe. I mean, I've been looking at maybe PhD programs. I'm taking a little break since I just finished my master's just to do some work. It really isn't, I still love my research on cats. And so I'm not really sure what direction I would take a PhD in, but you know, if that opportunity presents itself, I think it would be really helpful for people.
I was going to say, you mentioned your thesis was on queer women and cats, and I wondered if you're able to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would love to. Oh, I haven't looked at it in a while. Yeah, I mean, I think what I did, it was a phenomenological study. So I really just talked to folks about their cats in the Philadelphia area. So most everyone was local. And we talked a lot about, you know, I took a lot of queer theory and applied it kind of like family studies. So we talked about, you know, chosen family and how animals factor into your life when maybe your biological family isn't the most supportive. We talked a lot about dating, which I thought was interesting. We talked a lot about how women will use cats as a litmus test, specifically when they're dating straight men, not as much when they're dating other women. I had several people mention, like, my cat's really big in my dating life because if I talk to a guy who hates cats, I know that guy hates women and I can't explain why, but I know that there's misogyny there. So yeah, we talked a lot about like interpersonal relationships and families, and a lot of people would say kind of unprompted, like, I'm working from home on Zoom, and the thing that all my coworkers know about me is that I'm a cat person. They all know my cats' names, and they all know my cats. And so it was really it was a much more, I think, lighthearted work than my research on fat phobia is, because it was just really nice to talk about how much people love their animals and the role that those animals play in their lives. I had one person say, I practice secure attachment with my cat because I know that my cat isn't gonna, abandon or betray me. And I found kind of some data saying that there might be and I'm not the first person to say this, but just maybe expand on what folks had done before on whether or not our attachments with our animals can be considered under secure attachment model. So yeah, I ended up writing a very too long of a master's thesis on this, but yeah, I really enjoyed that work.
And I can totally relate to what you say about the litmus test. And it got me thinking of some of the anti-cat comments that I came across in my own research. And there's definitely misogyny there. And you see how sort of some of the anti-cat comments will immediately relate to women saying they're being fed by old hags, anemic vegans, and all sorts of derogatory terms towards women who supposedly keep cats. And it brings back to the whole childless cat lady thing too. And there really is a connection between misogyny and anti-cat.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to get too off topic, but we also just talked a lot about kind of queering the family, and how this love for an animal is a very queer way of loving, because typically our animals are, subservient, they're our pets, but that's not the impression that I got from my participants at all. They were and I'm sure most people think of their cats as their families and their pets as their families, but it did seem like kind of a much more equitable relationship than even I was expecting going in. And I thought that was really cool. A lot of people were yeah, my cat affects where I live, who I date, what I'm doing, where I'm staying at night. It's I can't stay overnight at someone's house. I have to go home and take care of my cat. And if they have a problem with that, that's their issue. We're just not compatible. And the last thing I'll say about it is just a really good essay anthology. And I can send it to you if you want. There's a PDF online. I don't think it's in print anymore. It's called Cats, and then in parentheses, and their dykes. And it's it's my most prized possession. It's the best book I've ever read. And I pulled a lot out of it. A lot of inspiration out of it when I was writing my thesis. Just one last comment, just kind of to wrap up. I think that's something that I was thinking a lot about as I was prepping for this was, I think my research is very cool. I think that it's kind of unwinding this narrative that we've wound, and it's because a lot of it is erroneous or biased. There's a lot that we have to do to unpack it. However, I also just want to not really lose the thread of if people were getting fatter, and if it was an individual choice, and if it was unhealthy, people and animals, we still have to be treating those people with dignity and kindness, and those people still deserve healthcare, and not to go to the doctor's office and be shamed for their bodies and told that their bodies are wrong. So while I think it's important to unpack what we've already created, and I think that that'll help us make progress and move in that direction, I just don't want to lose that thread, because at the end of the day, I think that's more important. I think the facts are important, but I think that just treating people with kindness and treating animals with kindness I just don't want to lose that.
I think it's important what you say, that if the human caregiver is treated with any even unintentional disdain, they're definitely going to avoid taking their companion animal for treatment, which has obviously a double knock-on effect. So yeah, I think it's a very important thing to say.
Yeah.
And it really extends the concept of one health to one welfare. So it's not just about health, it's about, welfare, compassion. And so, thanks for joining us for the Anthrozoology podcast. And Lisa,
join us again next time on the Anthrozoology podcast.